are a bunch of you online, but a little apologies. I'm a little under the weather. I smashed my hand this week and broke my wrist and actually kind of decimated it. If you look at the bone in my hand now, I have 8 little pieces. They're going in on Tuesday. I have to have surgery done, and they're going to be putting in titanium and 6 to 9 screws in my hand. The actual story, what happened, I got home very late from an event about a week ago from Indiana, had a 6 a.m. flight, had to get up at 3:45, forgot to turn off my alarm, and when I have to wake up really early, I set a really obnoxious alarm, and I forgot to turn it off. So when I got home, I only got home around midnight that evening, so I was traveling from 6 a.m. till about midnight. I just threw my clothes on the ground. At 3:45, that blessed alarm went off. I jumped up. It was in the bathroom. Ran to the bathroom, and I don't know what I tripped on, and I'm not even sure what I hit because I was so fast asleep. But I smashed my hand, and it is in not very good shape, and it hurts quite a bit. I tried to come up with a better story. My sister Mary Ann lives with me now, and the story I first came up with was that she got up in the middle of the night. She was angry with me for some reason and beat me with a cane and actually followed the blood trail to her room, so I knew she did it. But no one seems to believe that story. I guess unless you know my sister, then you know it might be true, but that's not what really happened. I took a little spill, and I don't bounce like I used to, so I'm a little under the weather tonight. I'm going to do the best job that I possibly can. I am in a little bit of pain, but we're going to see how well it goes. Kathy, I'll tell you tonight, we should probably have an opportunity to do some questions, which I haven't been able to do the last few webinars because they don't shut up, but we'll try our best to take a couple of questions. Look,
sounds good.
One continuous filament of thread to me is a very important aspect to the digitizing process. Number one, I was brought up by my father to understand that embroidery is best laid in one continuous filament of thread. Things like lace, you can't do it without doing it as one continuous filament of thread. In fact, not that many years ago, it was the only way embroidery could be created. Just 20-some years ago, we had no jump stitches. We had no trim stitches. Every digitizer, in fact, I ever trained, even when we began to have jump stitches and trim stitches, I used to teach my digitizers to program an entire design, not only one stitch at a time, but without any trims, without any jumps. Even if they had to walk across the middle of a design, it was that important to me. Running designs in a continuous filament of thread makes your designs run better. The art form of it truly is that of really learning how to hide stitches, to hide running stitches or travel stitches from one satin stitch to another, let's say, under other satin stitches. I'll even teach you tonight how to hide running stitches underneath running stitches. It makes designs run better. When you're doing small lettering, in fact, one of the great things about FTCU is in the 150 new fonts, 90-some% of them are created with closest point connect. There's a reason for that. I've always had, and I've talked about it a lot before, a pet peeve of when we finish a letter and step into a next letter, that thread sticks out like a sore thumb. It's because we normally make that movement in an elongated stitch. It's floating on top of the material, so it sticks out. It shows. I hate that stitch. In fact, I'm compelled many times to stop the machine and trim it out while it's running. I do show a little trick of hiding stitches in between small lettering by dropping little tiny stitches in between, which hides them, which means you never have to trim them out. But I'm going to show you a little different technique. But I want to give you a little tip. In learning how to create a design in one filament of thread, one of the best little tricks, and my son taught me this, he said, Dad, color your designs. we used to actually take the design we were about to digitize, we would print it out as large as we can, and we'd use colored pencils. If I had 4 or 5 colors in that design, I would pick the first color that I was going to digitize, I would lay that pencil down, and I would try to move through the entire design without lifting the pencil. It forced me, again, to learn how to hide stitches under other stitches. When you do that, the result is better running data. Normally, you're going to get a prettier design. You're going to get a design where you have a lot less trims in it, meaning a lot less downtime, because a lot of downtime takes place at the point of trims. It just seems to work better, so I'm going to give you some little lessons. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you how to do very small lettering in a continuous filament of thread. Now let me explain something, and this is kind of a fun, exciting aspect about learning how to do this. When you can create a design one stitch at a time, when you can create a design basically without lifting the needle or trimming minimally, you're actually taking a step back well over 120 years in this digitizing process. I think that's cool. You're actually learning how to digitize like my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, and myself first learned how to digitize. Again, we didn't have trims. We didn't have jumps. A design had to be thought through in order to create that design. So I'm going to teach you to do minute lettering. This is going to be, when I'm done with it, I have the design on the screen. It's simply the measurement technique. Those of you who have my book, you have this piece of artwork in it. Let me explain something. When you're doing minute lettering, one of the challenges with it is to get from one end of the letter to the other end of the, one end of the word to the other end of the word can normally be done, but in order to do it, you're normally having to use either 1 to 3 stitches, meaning a part of the design is going to be done with 1 stitch, part of the design will be done with, let's say, 2 running stitches, part of the design and able to do it is going to be done with 3. What I mean by that is, let's say I started here on this E in the word the. Will be pretty simple right here, because if I wanted to do the E in a double run stitch, and let me explain the reason why you would want to do it in a double run stitch. Thread has weight, measurable weight. If you do part of the design in a single stitch, it looks very different than a double run stitch. It looks very different than a bean or a triple run stitch. So we want to articulate this in in a double run stitch. Now look, if I started here on the bottom right of the E, it'd be pretty simple. I could come here to the E, I could step into the H, I could step up here, step over here, step up here, step into the T, come down, that would be once. Come back up, that would be twice. Come over to this part of the T, that'd be once. Come back, that'd be twice, that'd be twice. Come back into the H, that would be twice. Come down once, that'd be twice, that'd be twice. Come up, that's once, that's twice, that's twice. Come back into the E, that's once, that's once, that's once, that's twice. Twice, step out once, that's twice. Come down twice, step across, that's twice. But now I'm going to step into the M, okay? Now, in order to do the M twice and end up at the E, because I don't want to trim in between the M and the E, I would have to start here and I'd go once, 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 once. You'd have to come back twice, 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 twice. Now you have to come back through the M a third time in order to get to the closest point of the E. So I'm going to teach you a little trick. It's as old as embroidery itself. I think it's fun. You can literally just hand write out some running stitch or just some very narrow letter. You can scan it in. You can do it with any word. So look, I'm going to start here in the T. And what I am going to use is the manual stitch. Now let me explain. The manual stitch is probably the least stitch that you're ever going to use in the software. every place that you left click, the stitch is going to drop. If you use this or try to do this with the running stitch, you don't always get the right stitch length. These little red marks I call tick marks. If this is a 3mm stitch tall letter, these marks are about 1.5 millimeters in length. In order for a running stitch to show, you need a length of a minimal of 1 millimeter, so 1.5 millimeters is sufficient length for that stitch to show. So I pick my manual stitch. I'm going to come down here and pick just this color blue. I'm going to drop a stitch right here. 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 And then I'm going to make it look 3D so you can see as I'm moving forward. Now, to hide those little tiny run stitches in between the T and the H, I'm going to drop 2 to 3 tiny little stitches in between those letters. And I'm right here in the H. I come down, that's once. I come across, that's once. I come down, that's once. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter E. What I've basically done is I've done a continuous filament of thread from the T through the H into the E. Now I'm going to go ahead and change color so you can see as I pass back, we'll use another color and we'll just pick this purple right here. So I'm right here in the E right now. So I'm going to drop a stitch up here. That's once. That's once. Come across. That's once. That's twice. That's twice. That's once. That's twice. That's twice. That's once. That's twice. That letter E is done perfectly twice. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches back into the H. These stitches will not show. When you throw, the length of these stitches is about 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter. It's kind of against everything I believe in running stitch, because if you lay too many stitches too short, you're going to snap the thread. But 2 to 3 transitional stitches will not snap the thread. Those stitches will drive down into the fabric and you will not see them. So I'm right here on the H. I will drop a stitch here, that's twice. Come up, that's once. Come back, that's twice. Step across, that's twice. Come down, that's once. Come up, that's twice. That's twice. 2 to 3 little tiny stitches into the letter T. I drop one right here. Step across, that's twice. Right across here, that's once. Come back, that's twice. Come down, that's twice. Come back, that's twice. That letter the is done perfectly twice. I'm going to make my movement. Now here indeed, I'm going to use a trim. So I trim over to the M and I'm going to start right here in the M. So I'm going to drop a stitch right here in the M. I'm going to come up, that's once. 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 I'm right there. 2 to 3 tiny stitches into the letter E. Step across the bottom of the letter E. 2 to 3 into the letter A. Now let me explain something. Basically what I'm doing is I'm going the shortest way through the lettering that I possibly can. Okay? The only time I tend to deviate from that is in a letter A. In a letter A, I certainly could drop a stitch here, come across here, but when you do it like this and you're on your way back doing it the second time, it looks like you've got a little diamond or a little triangle on top of the letter A. So through the letter A, I always go the long way. It's the only letter that I do that through. So I'm through the letter A once, 2 to 3 little tiny stitches into the letter S. I'm going to drop a stitch here, drop a stitch here, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the U. I'm right there right now. Drop a stitch right there, drop a stitch right here, drop a stitch right here. I'm going to drop a stitch right here. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter R. Once I'm here, step across the letter R, step down. One time through the letter R, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter E. Step across the bottom of the letter E. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter M. I'm right here right now. We're going to walk through the letter M. We'll walk the whole way through the letter M. Right up through here, right here, right here, right here, right here. I'm right there now. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter E. Going to step across the bottom of the letter E. I'm right here right now. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter N. I'm right here, walk through the letter N entirely. Now, you know what? You'll notice also that I'm not exactly on the points. Realize this is 3mm lettering. Even if I'm a little off the points, it has no bearing. That is such a small distance. It has no bearing. I'm right here, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter T. I'm right here, come right here, and then step down to the bottom. And again, what I've done is one continuous filament of thread through the entire word from the M all the way to the letter T. Let's go ahead and change colors. We'll just change it to this yellow now. I'm right here in the T, so drop that stitch, come back up. That's twice, that's twice, that's once, that's twice, that's twice. The letter T is done perfectly twice, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter N. That's twice, that's twice, that's twice, 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 2 to 3 tiny stitches into the letter E. That's twice. Come on up. That's once. That's once. That's once. That's twice. That's twice. That's once. That's twice. Oops. And that's twice. Perfectly twice. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter M. That's twice. That's twice. That's twice. That's twice. 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 Twice, twice. The letter M is done perfectly twice, 2 to 3 tiny stitches into the letter E. That's twice, that's once, that's once, that's once, that's twice. Come back down, that's twice. Step out, that's once, that's twice. Step down, that's twice. 2 to 3 tiny stitches into the letter R, done perfectly twice. I step up here in the letter R, I come around, that's once. That's once, that's once, come down, that's once down to here, come back now, that's twice, 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 perfectly twice, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches back into the letter U, come up, that's once, that's twice, that's twice, that's twice, that's twice, that's once coming up here, that's once, that's twice coming back down, twice, perfectly twice, 2 to 3 stitches back into the letter S. That's once, that's once, that's once, once, twice, 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 perfectly twice, 2 to 3 back into the letter A. Now the long way through, twice, twice. Once I get to the crossbar, that's twice. Step across, that's once, that's twice. You'll have a magnificently beautiful letter A. That's twice, perfectly twice. 2 to 3 stitches back into the letter E. That's twice at the bottom. That's once coming up here. That's once coming up here. That's once. That's twice. That's twice. That's once. That's twice. That's twice, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter M. That's twice. That's twice. That's twice. 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 That word is perfectly twice. Now I'm going to go ahead and make a movement stitch into the letter T. I'm going to start right here, right there. That's once, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter E. That's once. Come back down the letter E, the left side. That's once, that's once, that's once. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter C. That's once, that's once. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into here. Once, step across the H. That's once, that's once. That's perfectly once through there. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the letter N. Come up here. That's once, that's once, that's once. Once, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the I. Step up. That's once, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the Q. That's once, that's once, that's once. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the U. Once, 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 once. 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the E. Once again, a continuous filament of thread through that entire word, and I'm right here right now. Let's go ahead and change color. We'll just change it to this green. So I'm right here right now. I step up, that's once. that's once, that's twice right there. Come back down, that's twice. Step out, that's once. Step back, that's twice. Step down, that's once. Step across, once, twice, twice. The E is perfectly twice. 2 to 3 stitches back into the U. That's once, that's twice, that's twice, that's twice, that's twice, twice, once, twice, done perfectly twice. 2 to 3 back into the Q. That's once, continue around, that's once, that's once, that's once, that's once, or excuse me, twice, twice, get a little confused with that sometimes. That's once, that's twice, that's once, that's twice, 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 the Q is perfectly twice. 2 to 3 back into the letter I, that's once, that's twice, twice, the I is perfectly twice. 2 to 3 back into the letter N, that's once, 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 come back down, twice, 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 twice. 2 to 3 back into the letter H, that's twice, come back up, that's once, come down, that's twice, come across, that's twice, step up, that's once, that's twice, that's twice. 2 to 3 back into the letter C, that's twice now, twice, twice, once, 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 twice, twice, twice. 2 to 3 back into the letter E, perfectly twice. 2 to, or excuse me, step across, that's twice. Step up, that's twice. Step out, that's once. Step back, that's twice. Step up, that's twice. Step out, that's once. Come back, that's twice. 2 to 3 stitches back into the letter T. We're right here. That's twice. That's once. Come back, that's twice. Once, once, twice, twice. And you've done that entire word perfectly twice with a double run stitch. Look, this gives you the ability to go smaller letter. Now, how can we utilize this with the software that we have today? Because in reality, how many times are you going to use this? Well, you know what? Once you learn the technique, you're going to use it more than you would imagine that you're going to use it, okay? So one of the things that I'd like to show you, I'm going to bring up some keyboard lettering. And I'm just going to go ahead and type my name, Walter, okay? Just 1 second. There we go. And I'm just going to type in all caps Walter, W-A-L-T-E-R. Now, in FTCU, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to find it, but in FTCU, we now have 4 different running stitch. I believe there's 4 different running stitch letters. But let me explain something. In order for running stitch letters to work in keyboard with a font technology, it has to be done basically with a bean stitch, because you have to start at one end and you have to finish at the other. So a bean stitch is a forward moving stitch, meaning that it's going to move forward, back, forward, forward, back, forward, forward, back, forward. So it allows you to achieve running stitch letter in a complete forward stitch movement. Because what I just showed you, how to path through a small word like what we just completed, there is no font technology currently that can figure it out logically how to move through it. So I'm just going to pick, and I believe this is a running stitch letter. So I'm just going to hit apply and bring up Walter, okay? Now, this is done with running stitch lettering, okay? Now, of course, one of the things when you have an L like next to a T is that we're going to move the, I'll make it look 3D right now. We're going to move the T a little closer. Let me just go into space. Well, I probably have to shut off the 3D. I do. I've got to click on the text tool again. That'll bring us to the higher level of editing. When I get on that blue spot, I can move the lettering closer. An L next to a T actually needs negative spacing when you're putting those letters together, okay? The way that fonts work is that you've got a left side and a right side. So when it spaces it, it's going to space the far left side of the T away from the bottom right of the L. So now this is done with a beam stitch. So as it moves through, it's going to come through, and it's doing it 3 times, okay? Steps in, and now it's doing the beam stitch, comes back up. Now in a beam stitch, it can do it 3 to 4 times, but it's at least a 3 time. Well, look, I want this to be, let's say 3 millimeter tall lettering, and I want it to be done very, very small. Well, can I do it? Look, with what you just learned, you can once again now pick your manual stitch, okay? You can come down here and select another color. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm using that letter that I generated from keyboard. I'm using it as a template. So if I told this and I made it, it's about 5 millimeters, but we'll just say it's 3 right now, okay? So what I'm going to do again here is I'm going to drop a stitch here. I'm going to drop a stitch in the center. Going to drop a stitch at the top. Going to drop 1 here. Going to drop 1 here. I'm going to take 2 to 3 tiny stitches into the letter A. Going to go the long way around the letter A. Going to step just once or twice into the letter L. Going to step across the L, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches into the T. I'm right there right now. I'm going to step up to letter T. Going to step across 1 time, 2 to 3 into the letter E. Going to step right here, going to step down, going to step down, going to step across. Just because the software can do what the software does mathematically doesn't mean it can always do, like I said, this double run stitch. But you can use it as a template. It's like your piece of artwork right now, okay? So we're right here in the R. So I can step right from here, I can step here, I can drop a stitch here, I can drop a stitch here. I've gone through it once right now. I'll change over to yellow, and now we can path our way back. There's twice, there's twice, there's once, there's once, there's once, there's once. Now I'm going to come all the way back. There's twice, there's twice, there's twice, there's twice, there's twice, there's twice. That letter is done perfectly twice. 2 to 3 tiny stitches into the letter E. That's twice, going to step up here. That's twice, step out once. That's stepping out twice, stepping up twice, stepping out once, stepping back twice. 2 to 3 tiny stitches into the letter T. That's twice, that's once, that's twice, that's twice, that's twice. 2 to 3 stitches into the letter L. That's twice, step up here. That's once, come back down. That's twice. That's twice into the letter A. That's twice. That's twice. That's twice. That's once. That's twice. That's twice. 2 to 3 back into the W. I'm right here. That's once. That's once. That's twice. That's twice. That's twice. That's twice. That's twice. That's twice. That's once. That's once. That's twice. That's twice. Don't let the fact that the way font technology works limit you from even going smaller. You can go down to 3 millimeters, sometimes even a little smaller if you're using our new micro thread. Minute work is some of the most incredible work that you can do in the embroidery process. Most of the time it has to be achieved with a double run stitch. Almost impossible to do unless you have like a stipple where you can go through it with a 1 time. In most cases, in most structures, you've got to use at least a double run. But realize 40 weight thread measures 4/10 of a millimeter in width. When you're going 3 times, you're building a width of a little over 1 millimeter in width. You might as well make it a satin stitch. So when you're doing it with a double run, you can get down to about 8/10 of a millimeter in width. That's a very, very narrow letter. Do not limit yourself to what the point is this, folks. By just understanding this little lesson that we just went through, okay, you've given yourself an ability to create things that most people in this industry cannot create. Taking that step back 120 years, it's fun. It's exciting, but it's limitless. It gives you limits and abilities that most other digitizers don't have. When I'm done with it, I delete the original one, and now I've just got what I've just done, one stitch at a time with a continuous filament of thread. Now, how else can I use that, or where else can I use that? Let me show you this also, and I'll just leave the name Walter up there again. Let me get rid of the other colors that we had up there, okay? Now, here's the stitch that I'm talking about. When we finish like here in the W, and it steps into the A, there's an elongated stitch that sticks out like a sore thumb. So where did what we just learned benefit that? Tiny running stitches hide themselves. They drive down into the fabrics, and you never have to trim that stitch. So what I do at this point is I come over to this icon, the stitch points. Stitch points are needle penetration points. Mark them, okay? When you mark the needle penetration points and you're in the or out of the 3D, you'll see little marks. So we're going to be right here. Okay, let me see why that didn't mark that right now. Let me select it. That need to be selected. Let me just mark the needle penetration points. For some reason it's not coming up. Doesn't really matter, because all you have to do is come in here to your stitch tool. When you get near the stitch, it's going to actually show you the stitch that you're on. I actually go into the next letter and I look for the first stitch in that next letter. There it is. At that point in time, it didn't show because the lettering is so small. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say insert before that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop 2 to 3 tiny little stitches between the A and the W, and I'm going to click that. Then I'm going to come over to the L and I'm going to find that first stitch. There it is again. Right click, insert before it. Drop a tiny little stitch or 2, okay? When you do this, do the same thing in the T. Find that first stitch. I always find it easier to find the first stitch going into the next letter. Right click, insert before, 2 to 3 tiny little stitches in between. Okay, what you've just done and continue. I go right through the T into the E into the R. You've eliminated that trim stitch right there. You're going to love me for that. Most of us hate that stitch. Many times if that stitch shows and we go to trim it out, okay, we'll unravel the letter before, because it's not using a proper lock stitch necessarily at the end of that W or at the end of that A. So once again, you're following the base rule of embroidery. A continuous filament of thread always runs the best. Now, that's in running stitch lettering. I want to bring up a couple of designs that I have where I show you how we hide running stitches under running stitches under satin stitches, because almost every design, until you get to lettering, almost every design, lettering, when teaching my digitizers that they had to create an entire design without lifting the stitch, the lettering was always the most difficult point, because many times you had to leave the logo structure, step across into the lettering. So certainly trims and jump stitches are a necessity. I do love them. But what I really tried to accomplish is I always wanted them to be able to create a design, the structure, the logo portion of the design, by hiding the stitches. And the fact is that you can hide running stitches under fill stitches to get from one area to another. You can hide running stitches below satin stitches to get from one satin area to another. You can hide running underneath running stitches. So I'm going to show you that, but before I do that, my God, I can't believe how much time. Kathy, if we have a couple of questions, I will take a couple of questions, and then I need to move right on into what I want to do next. Any questions, Miss Kathy?
Oh, I do have a couple of yes, I do, Mr. Walt. I have a couple of quick questions. One of them is, can you explain how you visualize to go through your pathing?
Yes, hon, that's when I alluded to the fact that I always, first of all, when I create a design, let me pull something else up here that I thought I already had up. But when I create a design, I look at a design dimensionally. And I'll bring up a design here. Just give me 1 second. let me go ahead and bring up my tiger design. But I'm going to bring up my columbine design, okay? When I sit down to create a design, I always look from the things that I perceive farthest away to the things that I see the closest to me. Now, I've done this in another webinar where I talk about dimensional embroidery. In dimensional embroidery, the stitch type creates the effect, but the stitch direction creates the dimension. It also creates the depth. So, an example, in this design right here, okay, I'm going to start this design, excuse me, let me stop it, but I'm going to start this design in the blue and in this fill stitch. Now, when I looked at this design, the sky was the farthest thing away from me. So it's the first aspect of the design that I'm going to do. And I lay a fill straight left to right. Now we have these sun rays running up and towards the sun done with running stitches. I saw those next as being the thing that came out at me next. So I do those next, and because I'm doing them at running stitches, I can change angles on it. The next thing that I saw are the mountains. Now, while in our FTCU we've created the special effects of a random technique which looks very much like this, we used to have to do this effect with what we called, interlocking satin stitches. So we would do satin stitches at random length edges and overlay them so they would create the effect as mountains. And you can see them starting to come out like that. The second ones look farther out than the first ones, the ones behind. Now I come in and I do the next part that looks out towards me. Okay? Now the next thing that I saw in here is I saw the snow caps on top of the mountains. And so I do the snow caps on top of the mountains. Why? Because again, just looking at it, I have the sky, the farthest back. I then have the sun streaks. I then have the mountains, and then I see the snow-capped peaks on top of the mountains. Now, as I'm walking through the snow-capped peaks, I'm outlining them. And if you notice, this design was done during the Columbine tragedy. We tried to have a lot of symbolization. So when I did the snow-capped peaks, I tried to do the running stitch outlines as doves flying towards heaven. Now, though, what I'm talking about with this one continuous filament of thread, I got from this area to this area to this area. I got from this area to this area to this area. What did I do? I walked underneath that satin stitch. All of those movement stitches, which many digitizers would use trims in or jumps, those are all done by connecting with running stitches underneath that satin stitch. So as we then move through, now we'll come along and we'll do that satin stitch border. Now you notice I didn't have to put underlay under that. I had 3 underlays underneath that border already. So I completed that entire segment. The next thing that I see in there is I see the leaves. So I did the leaves. Now what makes these so dimensional is that each leaf is going at a different direction. Brings tremendous direction again. Done with interlocking satin stitches. You have those in your software in FTCU, but by elongating your fill stitch of the random stitch, you'll create very much of that same effect. And again, each one is just simply moving from point to point, just using those stitches. Now we're going to outline all that. It's outlined, then the next thing I see is the internal part of the flower. Again, done with the same stitch type, each going a different direction. You realize at this point in time, I have no trims. In that entire design so far, where I've ended the one color, I've started with the next color, and I've been able to move under satin stitches. I've been able to move through running stitches. That's embroidery. That's how it's done. Now we come down and we're going to do the green is what I see next. Then I'm going to come in and jump inside, do the center of the flower. Then I'm going to do the outline of the flower. Then I'm going to jump down and do the lettering. Now, folks, while the lettering doesn't look real pretty on here, realize that what you're looking at is you're looking at lettering before the pull is ever consummated on the garment. So they look narrower. The R's look like it's going to close. The E looks like it's closed. Because of pull, that never will, okay? Those are going to stay nice and open. But if you notice, and I'll zoom into it, when we get into any one of these letters, you'll see that these letters are always connected with tiny little stitches in between. And if the E, certainly it moved over to the A, but other than the trims in between the words, there are no trims in between the letters. It steps in between those, and you have truly the only color changes you have in this design, or the only trims you have in this, are at color changes. That's it. The only other ones are when we go into the lettering. That's embroidery. That's utilizing the best of the technology that we have today, but with a little bit of the thought process of the past. That yields the finest running embroidery designs, and then by adding in the dimensional aspect, because see, every stitch in this design, the background left to right, different angles for the sun streaks. We go another angle for the mountaintops. We then go different angles for the snow-capped peaks. We do the outline, then we do the border. Then completely different angles for the flower, okay? Completely different angles for the stems, then into the lettering. When you look at that design stitch, the depth of that design. So how do we plan something like that out? We take our artwork, we take coloring pencils, and you color it. And Kathy, it's the darndest thing. When you color your artwork, and I did a test, I used to have my artists, they would draw my artwork for me, they would implant the stitches, and then they would color it, okay? I did 2 months one time where I had my artists, before they stitched the design in, I had them color it. 9 out of 10 times, the direction they took their pencil was the right direction to take the stitches to create the most dimensional embroidery. And because I told them, put that pencil down, and if you don't have to lift it, don't lift it. You're giving me a design then that I can pass through the entire thing without lifting the needle. One continuous filament of thread once again. Did you have another question, or should I move on?
Well, we do have one more question. It says, do you have an example of what 3mm lettering is included in our software?
With 3mm lettering, all you really have to do, because most of it runs down to about 4mm, because again, it's being done with that triple stitch, with a bean stitch. But it's just a case of, like I said, you use it as a template in order to create it. So there was the first one that I believe I ran into. So let's scroll down. There's another one right there. Your line block, that will go down to 3mm.
Great.
One that'll go down to 3mm. We've even put them in script. When we created these new fonts for FTCU, it was amazing. We had one font in the other platform that gave you running stitch lettering. Not only were we able, because see, the trick with doing it, even with a bean stitch, and why we're able to get away with it, a bean stitch and like lettering like this, is that we key in on the opening of the A's, of the B's, of the C's, of the R's, the opening sizes. Opening sizes has a lot to do with the size that you can make your lettering. Height is not the issue. Width is not necessarily the issue. What the issue is are the opening sizes. And in opening sizes with minute lettering, the smallest opening size, let's say in this letter A, is 0.8 to 1 millimeter. When you have an opening that open, and you've done it with a running stitch, even with a bean stitch, you're going to keep that letter open. So we've tried to give you the ability to use like a bean stitch and make it work. But in lettering like that, you realize I can go down to probably 2.5 millimeters in height with a double run. There's another run stitch there that'll take you down to, excuse me, that's a satin stitch. There was 4, I believe, already. I do believe there's 4 in there. If not, I'm going to have more coming because I love running stitch lettering. In fact, what I'd love to see, there's another one right there done with script. This will go down to 4 millimeters in height, but again, that's depending upon the size of this opening. And I do like now that when you click over it, you're going to get your minimum and your maximum size in both inches and in metric. You're going to get both of them on there, okay? So, and more are coming. And that closest point connect, if no one realizes, the beauty to that is that you're able to connect those letters at the closest point. That's amazing. Look, no matter what lettering that you use, because in FTCU you not only have straight lettering, you have your arch lettering, but you also have vertical lettering. When you do your vertical lettering and you're doing lettering that has the closest point connect, now watch, I'll probably pick one that doesn't have it, because there are only about 5 or 6 or so that don't have it. But even when I do, because realize if I were doing this lettering left to right, okay, it's going to connect at the far right side of the letter. But if I do it in a vertical, closest point connect now is going to connect it at the closest point from top to bottom. That was an amazing, because again, when you do them small, that differential, that height, this shrinks in between. Now, let me explain something. When you connect with those tiny little stitches, that's also for small lettering where the connection is about 0.8 to 1 millimeter, okay? Once you get much wider than that, those stitches do tend to show, unless you're doing it on a tonal, so that it's like tone on tone, or you're doing a light yellow on a white or something. Many times you can go a little wider, and if you throw your stitches a little shorter, they will not show also. But closest point connect on almost 100% of our letters is a big deal. It's a big deal. And you know what the biggest deal about it's going to be? Is that DJ and I believe that we're going to be able to implant those tiny little stitches in between automatically. DJ is giving me a look. He knows I'm right, though. We've been able to figure out so many things now with the software because of the amount of programmers that we have and because the amount of depth we can think about this stuff now. We want to revolutionize this embroidery process. I want to mix the old with the new. I want to give you the ability to take everything that's new in embroidery, but I want to embed in it the things that always made it work better, okay? Look, I look at what we've done with auto-digitizing now, and I think it's been revolutionized, and realize we're just getting started with it. We're just getting started with it. If you look at our last update and how well the C2S now converts to WAF, that's unheard of also. The way that it sees the stitches, not everyone understands. That's going to give us the ability over a little bit of time to take any design in any format and have it be read in the proper manner as if it was digitized within the software. We got a little time to work on that, but that's where this stuff is leading to. Starting on this platform that we're on now, it's a gift for myself, DJ. I'll tell you the truth. I've never had so much fun in my life, and I am so very, very excited. We're almost out of time, but I do want to show you one more design. It is my favorite design of all time, our Jumping Tiger design. And the reason that I want to show it to you is because this is a pathing masterpiece. There are white, yellow, orange, and black are the colors in here. There is not one trim stitch except at color changes. And I'm going to go ahead and do a slow redraw. It's also incredibly dimensional, but when you see it leave this foot, and now it's coming in here and doing the hair technique, which you can now do with our random fill stitching, okay? As it's moving through this design, First of all, every finger goes a different direction. That gives tremendous, tremendous dimension to the design. I'm slowing it down a little as we move. Stop it for a second, speed it up, okay. Now it's going to go after it comes down and does this other foot, and the reason it does this other foot last as it's coming down is because I want this other foot to be perceived as being in front of everything. So it's the last one done. It's done with an elongated satin stitch. Now, this is where it gets amazing because see these stitches right under here? They're done with very tiny little stitches. That's how we're going to hide running stitches underneath satin stitches. As it makes the transition from this side over to this side, it's going to walk down through here. Tiny little stitches, 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter. That's how we hide running stitches under running stitches. Right here, 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter, tiny stitches. Now, it walked all the way, and if you see it walked all the way out, I'm going to stop that right there. It walked all the way out of this side of the satin stitch yellow with tiny little stitches. Laid the satin stitch and then walks around the outside coming up with, you can see them, tiny little stitches in between. It's going to make a move over here next. It's an amazing design. Now it's covering it with satin stitches into tiny little run stitches. It's going to make one movement up to the black, but that's just a trim. You already see that yellow's been hidden because this was a double run. This went over it at an elongated stitch of about 2 millimeters in length. Elongated stitches cover short running stitches. And it's a perfect execution of 2 times. 1 time in, 1 time out, everything done perfectly twice. I truly believe you could study this one design for 4 to 5 to 6 months to learn pathing. The idea for me would be to leave it on the screen. One of the things we've left in the software is you can leave a digitized design on the screen, digitize on top of it, and you can literally duplicate a design like this. That's a wonderful, wonderful learning curve that you'd have. Everything done with exactly a double run. Now you're going to see it literally coming around the entire outside. It's going to finish in the nose, stitch the nose, and you have one of the finest running designs you'll ever put on your machine. One continuous filament of thread. I'm sorry I've eaten up all our time already. That was pretty good with a broken arm. I hope you all enjoyed that. Hugs and stitches to you. I so look forward to our next webinar. The more I do these, the more I love them. Folks, I swear I love every one of you out there. You're all my family members, my moderators, everyone who has anything to do with these webinars. You're awesome. Miss Kathy, as always, you're awesome. DJ, I don't know how I would do this without you. Thank you, everyone, for being part of the Floriani family. I'm sorry, but I do think it's the best time to be a member of the Floriani family of software owners. So the best to you. Hugs and stitches. I'll see you all next time, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing you next week or next webinar. Thanks so much. Good night.